Hey folks, I'm quite excited to share this video. It's a conversation between me and Nandini Nair. Nandini Nans, she's a friend of mine from Inspiral. She's a designer and now she's doing her master's looking at mutual aid networks. How does that work? How can we support them? So she interviewed me and it gave me a chance to have a rant for 45 minutes, which I really enjoyed. I talk a lot about social fabric and how we're reconstructing new kinds of kinship in this age of hyper mobile, hyper individualist 21st century. There's also a little rant there about my weird kind of politics and how I think what's the relationship between this kind of community building and the political moment that we're in. So stay tuned for that and please enjoy.
Um, so basically, okay, to give you a bit of a summary, so I had to come up with a thesis topic, and a topic that really interested me was mutual aid, um, especially because once the pandemic hit all over the states, there were these vast number of mutual aid networks that were popping up all over the place, and they were organizing in self-organizing in very interesting ways, and they were using nimble tools like Google spreadsheets and basically doing these computational things in the way that they were organizing. And so I got really interested in this topic, and I wanted to like research more into it. And as I've been looking at all sorts of different things, the history of mutual aid and like how mutual aid is happening right now, one thing that has come up is the idea of pods and pod mapping. Have you heard of the concept of pod mapping before?
Is that coming from I think where I heard pod mapping was with, what's her name? Mia Mingus, the accountability pods, those ones? Like
Yeah,
transformative justice stuff.
yeah. So I think accountability pods might be something similar. Yeah. Um, And so pod mapping is this activity where you kind of put yourself in the circle in the middle, and then you identify the people who
Mm,
could become your support network.
mm,
And so I've just been thinking about so that's like one kind of mapping activity which could be an interesting thing to explore in a design sense. But in general, I just want to hear about maybe some of the pod stuff that you've been doing. How some of the questions I'm interested in are like how many people per pod, what kind of is it, does it need to be people in a similar location,
mm,
um, do pods connect with each other? Yeah, just
mm.
yeah, go for it.
Cool. Yeah, I think of it like, uh, yeah, a design challenge. So it's cool to have you thinking about this. Basically, the picture I have in my mind is this complex network
Hmm.
called the social fabric. And like when you're talking about this computation happening, it's like the fabric is doing the computation, the fabric is doing the accountability, the fabric's doing the support.
Mm.
It's like it's all the connections between people. And and a lot of the work I'm doing, both in the community building stuff and in the organizational development stuff, is just like going into a context and looking at the fabric, and just being attuned to the fabric and going like, where are the rips and tears? Where is it getting a bit threadbare?
Hmm.
um, how can we stitch it back together, or like are there parts that are like really densely connected but not connected to each other, and can we like bring those together, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
um, and in a lot of cultures we have a lot of design to handle this, and if you think about it as kinship, so like
Hmm.
think about all the words that we have to describe relationships in an extended family, like
Hmm.
um, parents, second cousins,
Hmm.
um, and in some cultures, they're much more attentive to all of those second cousins once removed. Like kind of have all of this framework for saying like, this is you, these are all your relations, like this is how you fit in a system,
Hmm.
um, like a solar system, whatever. These are the different orbits around you at different depths, and a lot of meaning is conveyed with those words. Like you have different expectations of your siblings and your nephews, for instance, or your cousins, or like that. There's like, yeah, a lot of meaning encoded in that. And then I believe, and this is more of a like, I guess, an opinion, a political opinion, that we've been through this process, at least over the last 100 years, where those kinship networks have been basically dissolved for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's literally the kinship thing or the sort of like figurative kinship of your neighborhood or your church or your country that you really believe in or whatever, like
Mm-hmm.
people are more and more detached from that sense of being embedded in the social fabric. And that's causing a lot of problems. I think that's like the main, yeah, like it's my view into like what's going wrong in the world. It's mainly about that. It's like people are not having their need for belonging met, and therefore they're acting out in all kind of crazy ways. And that's why politics is this like complete chaos, is because people are looking for belonging. So that's like, that kind of situates the work that I'm doing. It's like trying to help people get back into, well, it's kind of like a new kind of kinship network. That's what I want to be in. And so when you talk about mutual aid, it's that, yeah, I mean, in lots of cultures at lots of times in history, if you had trouble, you'd go to your family, you know, and they would both, I mean, like you're staying at your parents' place, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's that's mutual aid, because probably at some stage later on, you're going to owe them a favor, you know, like when they get really old and like you'll be looking after them. That's how it kind of works, and we don't have to think about it very much. So you can kind of take that for granted, that your parents would be happy to have you in their house. And there's some accountability going on there too. Like they'll have some expectations about your behavior and the choices that you're making. And
yeah.
and of course that's like in when it's parent-child, right? Like, okay, there's some kind of power dynamic there. And so when I'm saying about like recreating new kinship networks, I'm looking for ways to do that without that power dynamic, where it's like more adult to adult, where people are opting in and it's less constrained to your own yeah, like your own weird family dynamics, you know, like whatever. I'm sure your parents are relating to you in similar ways to the ways that their parents relate to them, you know, like that there's this kind of like reproducing. I want to be more inventive than that. I want to be able to go like, oh, what if we, yeah, if we're inventing these new kinds of families in a way, like, can we invent a new lineage or like new ways of, yeah, like new cultures, basically, can we invent new cultures? And yeah, my view is that one of the things that we're lacking is language. Like, okay, if I'm not your cousin, you know, and I'm not your second cousin, like what is my relation to you? And that's why I've been focused on, yeah, naming pods. Sometimes they're pods, I call them crews, doesn't really matter. And that for me, the crews live inside of congregations. Also, that word doesn't matter. I just think it's funny, so I chose it. But the gist of it is like, the congregation is around the Dunbar size. So like, we don't know how big that is, but somewhere between 100 and 200 people. That's about as many people as you can manage in your brain and actually treat them as complex individuals and keep track of the relationships between them. And yeah, be like an effective agent that can move through that web of relations and like kind of understand the different dynamics and be a contributor there. That's the large space. And then the small space, yeah, the crew or the pod. I'm not sure, but my bias, at least at the moment, is that they're really small. I think 5 is plenty. I reckon it's that kind of 3, 4, or 5 seems to be the ones that I'm finding the most generative and the most meaningfully supportive. It's got to be bigger than 2, because it's like a 3-legged stool. Like a 2-legged stool is just not stable. Whereas with 3, it's there's like, someone can be speaking, someone can be listening, and the other person can be like, yeah, can be observing and kind of witnessing the sort of meta dynamics that are happening between those two people, or they can be just kind of ready to take the conversation in a different direction, or like they just add a whole lot more stability than the 2 can have. But then beyond 6, 7, 8, like, I mean, in my experience, it's like once there's 6 people in the room, it feels like, unless you've got a lot of time and a lot of like patience and forgiveness, it feels like you kind of need a bit of structure. You need like a facilitator or some kind of process. But with less than 6 people, it's often enough to just like, hey everyone, how you doing? what do we need to talk about today? And like, you kind of don't need, you can kind of be responsive to each other in a effortless way, and you don't need any more architecture than just like, yeah, there's a membership, you know, there's us, there's a sense of us, there's 5 of us, whatever, and we have some kind of rhythm of meeting, and that can be enough of a static container, and then the rest can just spontaneously happen between people, I think. But I haven't really seen that work with like 8 people, for instance. I don't think that's really feasible. But the reason that I name the crew and the congregation is because I think they need each other. Like, and that's why I also started by explaining my whole thinking around kinship networks. It's like, you can't have a sort of nuclear family without the extended family. It doesn't, it doesn't work. Like, your parents had to come from somewhere, you know, they had to learn parenting from somewhere. It's the same thing. Like, I don't think a pod can just, well, I mean, of course it can emerge from nowhere, and people will be drawing on experiences they've had in different contexts and and their imagination, and sort of they'll come up with something. But I think it's likely to go a lot better if it's in this context where there's other people that are also forming these pods, and that the experience of formation and being in a pod, like the lessons from those can be exchanged between. So that, like, because I think we're doing a remedial project like that. We used to have these skills where it would come naturally to us and it was second nature, and now that's been undermined for 100 years, and so like we have to kind of reconstruct it. So we need to have a bit of extra infrastructure around us to help us catch up with those lost skills.
So 2 questions. One is, can you elaborate on what you mean by infrastructure? And then second question would be, do you foresee in an ideal world that people would have many different types of pods, and what kind of pods, like what are the differences that could exist in a pod? Like some that maybe I can imagine is location based or purpose based, or you know, what are the kind of permutations and combinations of these kinds of pods? So yeah, infrastructure and then variations.
By infrastructure, I mean explicit, like agreements or practices that you're intentionally saying like, okay, we're going to try doing this thing for a while and see if it fits us. As compared to the implicit structures that like in New Zealand, in my friendship group in Newtown suburb, there's enough, the social fabric is dense enough, and there's enough kind of implicit experiential knowledge of how to do a really meaningful kind of friendship that they don't need an explicit structure. It's like there's this network of a couple of hundred people that know each other, and they just take care of each other, you know, like that there's just a real you know, a culture of like potluck dinners and house parties, and then these 2 people got together and they got married, and you know, and like these ones, you know, they're sharing a house or whatever. That there's not an explicit set of practices that people would be able to name. They don't have a name for what the group is or what the smaller groups are. Like they kind of don't need it. There's just enough density that it kind of works for itself. But when I went traveling away from New Zealand, I started to realize how rare that experience is. Like most people are not in those kind of networks. Especially, I mean, when I say most people, I mean most of the people I encounter, right? So like I'm dealing with young, you know, like kind of millennials who are urban and hypermobile, you know, like they've been moving between cities, and so like I'm not talking about everyone in the world, but the particular group that I'm working with, that they just don't have those kind of experiences, and so they need some explicit structure to like start. Like ideally we wouldn't need anything, and we say, oh yeah, it's my friendship network and it just kind of does all this amazing stuff for me, and then that would be fine, and maybe that works for some people, but I don't think it's enough. I think we need to like have these prosthetics, I guess, to make up for the loss. And so the infrastructure that I'm thinking of, like I mentioned, defining the boundaries of the group and saying who's in and who's out, and also like that you can have these nested groups, in the same way that you have your immediate family and your extended family, you know, like those things live inside of each other. And rhythm, like that's the kind of one of the most important, almost like a meta structure is rhythm, like having some frequency of engagement that's dependable, that, you know, once a week, once a month, whatever, like there's going to be this thing where these people get together and then suddenly the group assembles, you know, it's like, well, we're face to face or on Zoom for the moment, like this is where the group is, it's here. And then when we're not there anymore, it's like the group is in our imagination, it's in our history, but it's not present anymore. It's this kind of like, it's like a ghost. And then it becomes real again, it becomes embodied. And there's something about doing that at a dependable frequency, which I think does something to us. Like the more, like if I'm in a regular contact with a group, it kind of rises up my list of priorities and it becomes part of my identity. Whereas when it's something that's just like ad hoc and sporadic, this might be just my you know, kind of autistic brain, I don't know, but it might be something that I'm observing in reality, or it just might be me. But it seems like there's something about this, doing it with a period, that makes it more solid and more dependable and more real. So I really believe in that. And then other kind of structures, I mean, there's ways of communicating, which again is kind of subtle. It's hard to put your finger on, but it seems to make a big difference. So like, this is one of the things I think Inspiral is doing, is kind of incubating a way of communicating, and that people, when they come in, they sort of recognize that, oh, this is a bit different. It feels a bit unusual, something I really love, something that feels a bit awkward. And then they'll either stay and pick up the ways of communicating, or they'll leave because they're like, it doesn't suit me. But it's like, it's related to, say, nonviolent communication, for instance, like a way of owning your own experience, talking about your feelings, being direct about your needs and your requests of other people, being really attentive to consent and boundaries, and owning your own subjectivities, so like speaking from I, asking good questions, being an active listener. There's like a bunch of ways of communicating that seem to be effective for the process of becoming a group, you know, like I mean, that is, that to me is the kind of the big purpose. That's the thing. It's like how to be a group. That's why I'm doing, that's why I'm doing these groups, is to learn how to be a better group. It doesn't get very much more specific than that. That's kind of like what I think is interesting to learn about. And I think, yeah, that's implicated in like all kinds of solutions to like climate change and political dramas and all the rest. But I don't know how to specifically tie the two together. I just know intuitively that we need to be better at being in groups.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have a follow-up question, but do you want to talk about the other question instead?
Yeah.
Okay, go
just
for it.
quickly. If you have an open communication culture where people have a sense of psychological safety, where they can say whatever they mean, and it'll be respected, and they don't feel like it's too risky to be honest about their experience, and you have a rhythm of reflection where you go like, hey, it's been a month, or it's been 6 weeks, or whatever, how's it going? Does this group work for us? Do we want to try something new? Do we want to try some new structures? If you're doing that on a recurring basis, my hypothesis is that combination of like open communication plus structured reflection just gets you where the group needs to go, regardless of what the purpose of the group is. And there's just like a million different types of what those groups can be doing. So like, I was in one that we just we took an online course together. We wanted to learn about this particular facilitation technique. We all took the online course, and then we'd get together once a week and like talk about the stuff and do some practices. I'm in another one where we don't really have any formal structure apart from that we meet every 2 weeks, and everyone gets a turn. There's 5 of us. Everyone gets a turn to just give voice to whatever's going on in their experience, you know, and other people might inquire a few questions just to drag it out a bit more, like what's going on in there. And it's, I mean, for me, it's like place to practice vulnerability and being heard, and it's also a place to practice listening and witnessing without trying to fix people's problems. Just being like, yeah, man, that must suck. I hear that. And not jumping ahead where my instinct is always to want to fix. I'm also in a pod, which is a bunch of freelance contractors who are sharing work and sharing some of our income together. So we're building up an economic mutuality, like that there's a common resource that sits between us, and that we're building that intentionally, with the idea that, that as that little pot of money gets bigger and bigger, it kind of like the stakes go up and it becomes more, there's more potential there and more investment in each other. And there's any number of other like purposes that you could put these groups to as well, like a sports group, board games. You can have things where like you have 5 people that are all working on one project, or you have 5 people that are working on 5 projects and they're just using each other as a sounding board, or like, can I get advice on this? And people that want to test out specific kind of communication practices, they can do that with each other. And then I'm sure like lots of different things that I never would have thought of. It's just like what can you do with other people in a small group? It's really wide open.
Yeah. No, that was great. I liked how you phrased it as economic mutuality, and how like it could be other sorts of mutuality, right? And I wonder, like, what are your thoughts on like maybe the more like politically inclined nature of mutual aid groups being, so the tagline of mutual aid is solidarity, not charity. And the reason for that is not to recreate hierarchies or systems of oppression that maybe charity have created. And so I guess through these mutuality groups that you're forming, are you kind of is there an element of like a political ideal or a political motive that you're trying to embody, or
well, like I said, I think most of politics is completely fucked because people have such a desperation for belonging that they think they're doing politics, but what they're doing is tribal affiliation. They're like so hungry to be accepted by a group that they will adopt some kind of political stance so that they have a sense of community, not so that they're going to be effective and actually achieve their political aims. And that it's like this whole pantomime that's going on with people saying like, oh yes, I really care about universal basic income or environmentalism or whatever my purpose is. But really what's happening is I'm so fucking lonely. I don't understand the world. I'm desperate and I need some people around me to make it feel okay and like I've got a place here. And for some reason, we're not allowed to admit that. And so everyone's got to pretend like, oh no, it's actually about the politics. It's actually about the mission. It's not about my need for community. And so therefore everyone has to claim that they're right. And like, and so we have this, like, I just think the most absurd politics, like I'm really, like over the last 10 years, I've gone from being an anarchist at Occupy and then coming through and now into this weird sort of what they call meta-modern, like kind of out the other side of the left in a way. Like I just look at the left now generally with a bit of disgust and like, it doesn't work. Like it clearly doesn't work. I really don't believe in all the things that I'm supposed to believe in. I can't honestly say I believe in it anymore because it doesn't work. And if it made sense, we would have done it by now, but it just doesn't make sense. And people can't see that it doesn't make sense because of this, the way that political community has been formed around orthodoxy. Like, oh, we'll all agree on the right values and the right tactics and the right strategy, and we'll all preach the same thing, and then we get to belong. And we exclude all the heretics that disagree with us, and we've got this lovely, stable sense of identity. But if you're doing that and you're like not open to dissent, if you're not hearing the people that are disagreeing with you, like you're not intelligent. Like you've got no access to intelligence. And so we've got all these political groups that are isolating themselves from intelligence and really being super committed to the idea that they're right. So that's why I'm on a mission, which is about reconstructing community. And then people can do whatever politics they want, but I hope they'll do it in a more mature way that's like actually being strategic and looking at what needs to change in the world, where are we moving, like what levers are we pushing on to achieve that change, how are we forming smarter and smarter ideas, you know, like how are we testing our assumptions, how are we making progress and measuring that progress. Like we could do that stuff if we weren't so intoxicated by our need for belonging. That's the hypothesis.
Interesting. No, I think that's really interesting. And I can recognize with some aspects of it as well. I have a question around okay, so broadening it out. So you mentioned psychological safety. I was listening to a Team Human Douglas Rushkoff podcast. He had brought a futurist on there to talk about mutuality, and the speaker was saying how more and more in America there is less psychological security. So in the past, you know, there was this sense that, you know, you could rely on the medical system, you could rely on the police to come and save you or bail you out or whatever if you're in trouble, but less so now. So that's why mutual aid groups are popping up, or like as a way to like meet some of these kind of needs within a community. Do you think, yeah, like what is your reflection on that? Like, you know, since you have talked about your own kind of political view of how people are intoxicated for this need of community, do you think, like, what is that relationship between these like small groups and this bigger infrastructure that we all need to rely on?
Yeah, that's another big question. I think what we're going through at the moment is like, it's kind of like the transition from modern to postmodern. Like the modern thing being, there are these singular institutions that have an understanding of truth and reality, and they kind of like, we can put checks and balances in them so we can trust them and they'll do good things. So like science, progress, reason, law, like that. I mean, the media, you know, this idea that when I was a teenager even, there was a thing called the 6 o'clock news, and most of the people in my country believed that that was the important information that was happening. You know, like that every day there's a little summary and it's like, these are the things you need to know about. And then the next day there'd be another list, and there's this like single broadcast, you know, point of a single perspective, which is like, look, trust us. You know, we know what's going on. We've got the best journalists in the country. We've got the best access to information. This is kind of the important stuff. And people believe that. Like that was really an acceptable point of view. And in retrospect, I don't think that was true. I think there was always a lot of different important stuff happening. And most of it was invisible to those institutions. But it was quiet. People weren't hearing it, and so we could get along with the oversimplification of like, oh yeah, there's a single agenda every day that we need to pay attention to. We don't have to worry about all the other voices that are being excluded. And now, partly because of like just cultural evolution, and partly because of technical innovation, like now we have to deal with postmodernism. We have to deal with the fact that like that single institution cannot get a grip on truth. That like actually truth is this chaotic, multi-dimensional, multi-perspective kind of like, every time you put an agenda and say this is the 6 o'clock news, it's like, yeah, but there's 99 other equally valid collections of things you could talk about that you didn't talk about, and how interesting that you're ignoring all of those. And like the way that they've ignored those is really, there's a lot of meaning in their decision of what they included and what they didn't, you know, and it reflects power dynamics and all this. So like, I think that's part of what's going on here, is that where in the past we could just kind of believe in these oversimplified, imaginary, you know, like I think the world has always been complex. I think the world has always been infinitely complex, but we could kind of get by with these oversimplified narratives. But now, because everyone, we're not in a broadcast era anymore, we're in a like multi-directional, everyone can reach anyone kind of thing. We can't ignore all the other voices anymore. And so they're suddenly all coming online and being like, hey, you've not been listening to us, and you've not been listening to this and this and this. And there's just like this infinity of different perspectives. And institutions are just not designed for that. You know, like institutions are designed to really like take complexity and funnel it down into simplicity. And now that just won't stand. And that's just a really disrupting process for everyone. And the whole gesture of postmodernism is this deconstruction thing of like, every time you say something, there's a postmodernist to say, yeah, but what about not that thing? You know, and it's like, this is also why the left sucks at the moment, because it's just like having to go through its deconstruction phase where everything, So
being in grad school in the US, I experienced that at a lot of different levels. So yeah, okay. So you feel like because we've moved into this phase that where it's harder to know what the truth is, or harder to there is less psychological security maybe in some of these institutions.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really destabilizing to constantly have your view of the world challenged, to be always interrupted by, hey, but you haven't thought about this, completely different view, which challenges you. And not just challenged like, oh, it turns out that oranges are actually blue, but more like, it turns out that this whole mythology of oranges is because of your privilege and your ignorance. You know, like that's not just a competition between two equally valid facts. It's like, actually there's like personal implications, and it's really confronting. It's like, you have been treating me unfairly because you haven't, you know, because we've been unheard for so long. So it's this really destabilizing and uncomfortable thing that we're going through. And my view is that it's getting us closer to an actual encounter with reality. But it's just really, it's a really awful process. It's really uncomfortable. People hate it.
Yeah, Obama recently said, right, like we're living through an epistemological crisis, where we just talking about complete, like the left and the right are talking about two completely different things. And so yeah, I think it is going to be a very interesting decade coming up, for sure.
And my big picture view is that I think postmodernism is actually a really small moment. And this is why I said I feel like I'm a metamodernist, which is a thing that comes after postmodernism, which is again much more of a constructive phase rather than a deconstructive one. And I really think there is a way to integrate postmodernism to like, to be able to handle all these different perspectives, but not get trapped in the constant attack mode, but to be constructive, to create new kinds of institutions that are actually network native, you know, that can just handle pluralities, you know. So I'm imagining a future where it's like, you know, decoupling nation states from territories, for instance, so that you can be in one physical location, but you can choose between 5 different nation states depending on your values. Like, I think we're gonna head in a direction like that, where there's just more complex structures and governance systems and so on. And this sounds like I've gotten off track, but this is completely what I'm trying to do with the Micro-Solidarity Project, which is like equipping people for a world in which there are just way more perspectives than you can ever get your head around. And that part of what's going on in these mutual aid groups is just like I said, learning how to be a group. And when you're allowed to, my view is that when people really feel safe and they're allowed to say whatever's going on for them, they will discover that in a group of 5 or more people, you've got infinite diversity, and that no one actually agrees on the fundamentals of life, you know, like that there's just so much, the human experience is so different. And we just like in normal life, we just kind of pretend just to fit in, to get on with things, to like not cause alarm or drama. We like kind of go along with like what everyone else is saying. But I think I think that's done by unconscious kind of repression and conformity pressure. But like once we take that pressure off and people actually feel liberated, they'll discover like this infinite variety between different humans, and learn how to make peace with it. And that's the project. It's like, can you make peace with pluralism and still and still get up in the morning and still have a sense of progress and like purpose and like knowing what your place is and what you're working on. Like that's a hard process, and it's I've seen it happen in small groups where people kind of go through the deconstruction of like, hey, your view of reality is limited. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. It's like, my identity, I'm disintegrating, and then get reconstructed out the other side. Like, oh, it's amazing. It's not a loss. It's actually this huge abundance that I've gained from having access to all these different views. That's like a deconstruction and reconstruction process.
Yeah.
I don't suspect that that's going to go really smoothly at the like large scale social scale, but I think we can do it in small groups.
So, are there any techniques or kind of tools or practices that you use to help people in their little communities, in their pods, to contend with some of these ideas, and as it challenges their identity? And yeah, does anything come to mind?
Yeah. This is we're kind of in an R&D project now, you know, and when I say we, I mean Nati and I have anchored a new chapter of Inspiral in Europe, but then at the same time I've been documenting this for like, well, most intentionally for the last 18 months, and a whole bunch of other communities have kind of responded and said like, oh yeah, that language helps describe what we're doing. And so now I'm in a network with maybe 20 or 30 other communities that are all prototyping these practices and trying to do mutual aid and see what practices work. So we're working out what are structures that actually help. And I haven't found many yet that I really have confidence in, because I think a lot of the work is happening in this much more subtle dimension, and it's about like, there's something that you can do where like you get a practice and you you document it on a PDF and you send that around, and it's like, step 1, ask everyone this question. Step 2, give them 5 minutes to write. Step 3, there's that, which is kind of like the explicit tip of the iceberg. And then the implicit thing is like the extremely subtle but really potent ways of communication that you can't really write down and say what's happening here, but there's something where people are creating, they talk about like a field or resonance or like, people are reaching for, holding space. That's another one people use, creating a container. There's these kind of metaphors to try and name what the fuck's going on there. It's really hard to be precise. But I think that we have really subtle, really complex, really advanced knowledge of like how to relate, that we inherit from experience, like that we get we learn through a lineage, that it sort of gets passed on to us by, like, if you go and visit a really mature, really thriving group, you kind of pick something up off them and you don't even know that it's happening, but it's this like tacit knowledge that gets passed on through contact with them. And then once you learn how to do that a bit, then you get to pass it on to other people. But you can't write it down. Like, it's in the nature of the knowledge that it's not graspable. Like it's picked up by experience, and it's really, really hard to see what's going on. So I'm not really that confident that we're going to find a lot of these PDFs, that are really tight. One that I do know, the case clinic process from Theory U, that's actually one that I really do believe in. And generally, I mean, the whole liberating structures, there's like 20 different practices there. I'm generally a fan of them, as far as they get you pretty far with no subtlety and no nuance and no complexity, just like, here is a list of instructions. They get pretty far. There's another kind of meta pattern, I think, is like, notice what triggers you and move towards it gently rather than retreat from it. And that seems to get people, and when I say move towards it gently, I mean like, don't overdose. Don't just like re-traumatize yourself, but notice where are there like triggers that you're actually like, people talk about titration, like just having a little bit. Can you take a little bit of that without getting overwhelmed, but actually go into it and look what's going on here? That seems to be extremely generative and instructive when you can create the kind of safety where people are willing to go into their triggers instead of away from them. and that seems to have a clarifying, clearing up kind of work that happens there. And again, it's like, how do you do that? I mean, now we're in the territory of therapy, so you need a psychology degree to have anything credible to say on that, and even then, like, a lot of psychologists don't know what the fuck they're doing. So it's it's really hard to be able to pinpoint things and say like, oh yeah, you just do this and it works. Like, I think it's, yeah, I've got much more belief in the implicit, extremely nuanced, the kind of elders, you know, the elders, people that have experience in passing it on. I've got much more confidence in that than I do in our ability to write stuff down and turn them into reproducible practices.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. That's really interesting. One of the goals maybe for my thesis is to kind of create a grammar for mutuality. And I think some of the things that I got out of this conversation were around maybe I don't want to say creating safe spaces, because I know there has been critique on the idea of safe spaces, but maybe kind of addressing some sort of psychological safety within the group. So it's okay to kind of show up as you are. And then maybe there was another aspect of like agility and agility and then responsiveness. So are there any other words that you might add in terms of like what mutuality maybe means for you? And then we can wrap it up, because I know we have only a couple of minutes left.
I really like those two. I think those are kind of like the pillars. And they're the pillars for any kind of effective group function, I think, in any group that's trying to innovate into an uncertain, complex territory. Yeah, I guess the other thing is, like I said at the start about social fabric, it's like this transformation that happens. Well, there's a bunch of transformations. One of them is about moving from a view of the world which is about things to a view which is about relationships between things. That once you get that, it's like it's like a house of cards comes down in a way. And it's like an insight that I've had that I'm still nowhere near the end of. It just keeps happening. Like, oh wow, fuck. You know, like the other day I've been learning more about music theory and realizing like, oh, okay, so that's the same thing applies in music. Like, it doesn't matter what notes you play. It's like the relationships between the notes. That's what makes the music. Like, fuck, oh, of course. Yeah. Of course. So yeah, there's that relationship perspective. There was another one that I wanted to say. Oh yeah. There's the subject object thing. So like the transformation from being a subject of culture to treating culture as an object that you get to manipulate, that's mind-blowing as well. Like when you know, most people are just participating in the culture that they're in, and they don't really look at it as an object that they can change. But when you work out that, like, hey, you know, we actually get to choose our protocols of engagement, and we get to choose which values that we want to amplify, which behaviors that we want to bring out more. And when that becomes a self-aware process of like R&D and testing and stuff, like that's really exciting and really generative, and people get really like hyped, and it's like yeah, it gives me hope that like we can actually, it's kind of like you know, people like root their smartphone so that they can put different kind of software on it. So you're getting access at the admin level, and you can you're like, oh wow, suddenly I can do all this extra stuff that I didn't realize was available. It's kind of like that when you become self-aware about culture and how you get to change it. It's like, I was raised in this culture that actually there's a whole bunch of stuff about it that doesn't support me to be my best version of me, but we can just make a new kind of culture that brings out different aspects of ourselves. Like, that's a superpower. And so yeah, it's super fun. I think that's the other big thing, is just like, it's when you're doing it right, it's really fucking fun and attractive, and it's self-fueling because it feels so good to be doing it. And it doesn't have to be this like labor, it doesn't have to be a struggle, it's just joy. That's a test that you're doing it the right way, is that it has this like self-perpetuating energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds really cool, and I like how you package that as relationality. Um, it's very relevant to some of the stuff that we've been reading in my grad school program. I can probably send you a bunch of literature that would be relevant, that you might find interesting as well, or that you might have maybe already come across. But there's definitely some good stuff in how you framed it. I would love to talk more about like how you said protocols of engagement, and then how that protocols relate to maybe this more technological idea of protocols. But maybe that's a conversation for another time. So yeah, thanks a lot, Rich. I think there are a bunch of things in this conversation that I could take and do something with. So yeah, really great.
It's real fun for me to be interviewed by someone that's interested in a bit of the bigger picture than just like, how do I do a conflict or something? Like, it's really it's a treat for me to be able to rant for a while about what's going on inside my head. So thank you. And I'm up for it again if you want to do it again later down the line. But
cool.
if that feels